Why did the silence feel heavier than the gunfire that was sure to come? Lieutenant Maya Carter stood alone at the edge of the rocky outcrop, the last gold threads of daylight brushing her uniform. The wind tugged gently at the loose strands of her hair, whispering across the barren mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. To anyone else, it might have been a view worth pausing for, a picture of peace before nightfall. But to her, it was a warning. The calm before something violent, the fragile breath before the storm hit. She tightened the strap on her chest rig, the coarse fabric biting against her gloved fingers. The weight of her medical pack pressed against her shoulders, familiar, grounding, and suffocating all at once. It wasn't just gear. It was lives, compressed into metal tools and rolled bandages. Every vial, every syringe, every coiled tourniquet represented a second stolen from death's grasp. She exhaled slowly, letting her breath disappear into the cooling dusk. Below her, her team was assembling, 6 silhouettes moving in perfect, silent rhythm. They were ghosts against the jagged terrain, seals whose every movement spoke of precision born from years of discipline. Maya could pick each one out by the way they moved. Reynolds, their captain, always steady and deliberate. James, the youngest, with that subtle twitch in his step that told of nerves he tried too hard to hide. And then there was her, an outlier, the medic, the one who healed rather than destroyed. She crouched and adjusted the strap of her pack again, pretending the simple motion might calm her racing pulse. Her heartbeat was steady but hard, like a drum signaling a truth she couldn't ignore. This mission wasn't like the others. They'd been briefed on the essentials: covert infiltration into hostile territory, neutralize a high-value communication hub, extract intelligence, and disappear without a trace. On paper, it was simple, but Maya had seen enough simple missions unravel into chaos to know better. There was no such thing as routine when lives were at stake. A faint vibration pulsed on her wrist. She glanced at her watch. 18:47 hours, 13 minutes until insertion. The glowing digits reflected faintly off her skin, and in that light she caught the shimmer of something else, the silver trident embroidered above her heart. Her father's trident. She brushed her fingertips across it, a motion as subtle as it was reverent. The metal thread was worn at the edges, but it still gleamed with quiet authority. That insignia had been more than a symbol of service. It was a legacy. Her father had earned it decades earlier before his final mission, the one he hadn't returned from. When she'd been handed his emblem at the funeral, she hadn't cried. She just stared at it, silent, promising herself she'd make it mean something. Now, standing on a foreign mountainside, she wondered if she truly understood what that promise cost. The radio on her shoulder crackled faintly. All units check in. Operation Silent Storm begins at 1900. Confirm readiness. Captain Reynolds' voice carried that familiar weight of command, calm, low, unyielding. Maya pressed her earpiece. Medic ready. Copy that, Reynolds replied. We move on my mark. Her hand dropped to her thigh, fingertips brushing against the Velcro of her cargo pocket, checking for the morphine injectors, the compression bandages, the hemostatic gauze. She'd memorized their placement 100 times over, but checking gave her a small measure of control. Out there, control was everything. The faint thump of rotor blades began to build in the distance, reverberating through the valley like a distant heartbeat. The helicopter crested the horizon, a dark shadow against the bleeding sky. The team gathered near the ridge, their eyes glinting beneath their helmets. No one spoke. There was no need. In the silence between them, there was an understanding that words couldn't reach. Maya gave one last look at the horizon. The colors of sunset were fading now, swallowed by creeping darkness. She could almost feel it wrapping around her, cold and familiar. This is it, she thought. One more mission, one more night to survive. The helicopter's downwash blasted against her face as she climbed aboard. The cabin lights were dimmed, red illumination bathing the interior in a muted glow. The air was thick with tension and the scent of oil and metal. Across from her, Reynolds gave her a nod. We hit the drop zone fast and quiet, no mistakes tonight. Maya returned the nod. Wouldn't dream of it, sir. He almost smiled at that, but his eyes betrayed something else. Worry, perhaps, or the quiet awareness that every mission had its price. The flight was short, but the minutes stretched long. The rhythmic hum of the rotors faded into the background of Maya's thoughts as she replayed the plan in her head. Infiltrate, secure, extract, heal, repeat. But beneath the mechanics of the mission was something unspoken, a weight she couldn't name. It had been growing in her for weeks now, that creeping unease that came before the world changed in ways no one saw coming. She tried to shake it off, closing her eyes briefly as the wind howled against the fuselage. 10 seconds, shouted the crew chief. The back hatch yawned open. Cold air poured in, biting through their gear. One by one they dropped into the dark, swallowed by the night. Maya was the last to jump. Her boots hit the ground with a muted thud. The earth was dry, brittle beneath her. She crouched low, scanning her surroundings as the helicopter lifted away, its shadow vanishing into the distance. The team moved out immediately, their figures blending into the terrain. The air was different here, heavier, full of the faint scent of dust and cordite. Every sound mattered, every silence spoke. They advanced in tight formation, rifles sweeping the darkness. Maya's role was to move with the rear, scanning for movement, listening for breaths that didn't belong. The night was thick, but the stars above were sharp, cutting through the void like cold eyes watching. Minutes passed, then hours, or maybe it just felt that way. The terrain grew harsher, the rocks jagged and uneven beneath their boots. Then, just as they reached the perimeter of the enemy compound, a flicker of movement. A shadow darted across the ridge, then another. Reynolds raised a fist. Stop. The team froze. Silence. And then the night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the still air, sharp and violent. The first rounds hit the rocks inches from Maya's leg, spraying shards of stone across her face. She hit the ground hard, instinct driving her behind a boulder. The roar of rifles filled the night, and suddenly the tranquil valley became a war zone. Maya status, Reynolds' voice cut through the chaos. I'm good, she shouted back, breath ragged. 2 men down. The medic in her took over before the soldier could think. She crawled through the dirt, bullets whipping past, heat and grit stinging her skin. Ahead, Petty Officer James was sprawled out, clutching his thigh. Blood darkened his uniform, pooling fast. Hang on, James, she yelled, sliding beside him. Her hands moved on instinct, tourniquet high and tight, twist, secure, check for a pulse. The blood flow slowed, but his breathing was shallow, uneven. You're okay. Look at me, she said, voice steady despite the storm around them. You're not going anywhere tonight. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a strained gasp. Didn't plan to. Her heart clenched. She squeezed his hand briefly before signaling for cover fire. The team shifted positions, returning fire in controlled bursts. The enemy was closing in, flashes of muzzle fire lighting the rocks ahead. Reynolds, I need evac for James, Maya called out, dragging him toward the nearest cover. Negative, came the reply. Too hot right now, hold position. She gritted her teeth, pulling him behind a low ridge. Her arms burned with effort, but she didn't stop until they were shielded. Then, just as she reached for her pack again, a bullet slammed into the rock beside her, fragments slicing across her cheek. Pain flared, but she didn't stop. Her gloved hands pressed down on James's wound again. The dirt beneath them was slick with blood. Stay with me, damn it, she whispered. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, louder than the gunfire. The world shrank to this one moment, 2 lives tethered by duty and desperation. Then in the chaos, her eyes caught something through the haze of smoke and dust, a shape moving toward them, not one of theirs. Enemy. She reached for her pistol, firing twice. The figure dropped. The gunfire slowly began to fade. The SEALs were pushing back, driving the attackers into retreat. Reynolds' voice came through again. All units, regroup at extraction point Charlie. Move now. Maya tightened the tourniquet one last time and hauled James up with a grunt. He was barely conscious. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she refused to stop. Every step through the ravine was agony. The rocks tore at her knees, and every jolt sent fire through her ribs. But the chopper's distant blades called her forward, a promise of survival she could abandon. When the team finally reached the extraction point, the helicopter's floodlight cut through the darkness like salvation. They loaded the wounded first, the medics working fast. Maya climbed in last, collapsing against the cold metal floor. Her hands trembled as she stared at them, covered in blood that wasn't hers. The cabin filled with the sound of strained breathing and shouted commands. But for Maya, the world had gone quiet again. That strange, heavy silence, the same kind that had settled before the battle. Her gaze drifted down to her chest, to the emblem stitched over her heart. The silver trident gleamed faintly beneath the red cabin lights. And for a brief moment, she wasn't on that helicopter. She was a little girl again, standing beside a folded flag, staring at the same emblem pinned to her father's coffin. She reached up and touched it, her fingers trembling. "Not yet," she whispered under her breath. "Not tonight." The helicopter lifted higher into the black sky, carrying with it the wounded, the weary, and the weight of survival. Below them, the battlefield vanished into shadow, but the echoes would linger, inside her, where silence screamed louder than war ever could. The helicopter's rotors pounded against the night air, echoing like a war drum inside Maya Carter's chest. She sat wedged between two wounded teammates, her gloved hands still slick with their blood. The red emergency lights painted every face around her in ghostly hues, men who were alive, but barely. She kept her eyes fixed on the medic opposite her, a young corporal named Hayes who was working on James, the kid whose leg she had saved. Hayes met her gaze briefly and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the effort that had kept the young man breathing. "Pressure's stable for now," he shouted over the roar. Maya didn't answer. Her throat was raw from the dust and her ears still rang from the firefight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the chaos was fading, replaced by the heavy crash of exhaustion. She looked down at her chest. The fabric of her uniform was torn, smudged with grime and streaked with crimson. Her blood, their blood, it didn't matter anymore. It was all part of the same story. The silver trident stitched over her heart gleamed faintly in the red light. Her father's emblem, the symbol that had carried her through training, through nights of doubt, through every brutal trial that tried to break her. And yet, tonight, it felt heavier than ever. She tilted her head back against the vibrating hull and closed her eyes for a moment. The rhythmic chop of the blades blended with the hum of her pulse, steady but uneven. For a fleeting second, she let herself drift. "Lieutenant!" Her eyes snapped open. Reynolds was kneeling in front of her, shouting over the noise. "You still with us?" She nodded, forcing a breath. "Always." He gave a curt nod. "We lost comms halfway through. No word yet from secondary team. When we land, triage first. You take lead until the doc catches up." "Understood." The captain's gaze lingered on her for a second longer. He noticed the faint streak of blood along her jaw, the distant look that didn't belong to the medic he knew. But he said nothing more. The helicopter jerked as it began to descend, the lights of the forward operating base flickering in the distance. Relief washed over her, but only briefly. The fight might have ended, but the battle never really stopped. It just changed form. When the skids touched down, the team moved fast. The wounded were carried out first, their groans drowned out by the deafening noise of the rotors. Maya followed, her boots sinking into the dusty ground as she helped lift a stretcher. The night air was cool against her face, but every movement sent a jolt of pain through her ribs. She ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythmic commands shouted around her. Inside the triage tent, the world narrowed again. Bright lights, the metallic tang of blood, the relentless beeping of monitors. "Get me O-negative on standby," a medic yelled. "Clear that table, move, move." The controlled chaos was both familiar and suffocating. Maya's instincts took over. She stripped off her gloves, replaced them, and stepped into the blur of movement. Her hands worked without hesitation, checking vitals, applying pressure, issuing orders. Tourniquets holding, start fluids. Push morphine half dose. Keep his airway open. Each command left her lips calm and steady, but her mind was a storm beneath the surface. She could feel the tremor in her hands, the fatigue clawing at her focus. Yet she refused to stop. There was always another wound to patch, another life to anchor. Hours bled into one another. By the time the chaos began to settle, the first light of dawn was seeping through the seams of the canvas. The air smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Soldiers limped in and out of the tent, faces pale, eyes hollow. Maya finally leaned against a supply crate, her body trembling. Her ribs ached with every breath, and her fingers were raw. She looked around at the men and women she had helped pull back from the edge, and yet all she could feel was the weight of the ones she hadn't reached in time. She pressed her palm against the trident on her chest. It was cold to the touch now, as if it too had absorbed the chill of the long night. Chief Medical Officer Daniels appeared beside her, his weathered face lined with fatigue. "You look like hell, Carter." Maya gave a faint smirk. "That makes two of us, sir." He handed her a water bottle, his eyes scanning her face. "You need a checkup. You took a hit, didn't you?" "It's nothing," she muttered. He sighed. "Every medic says that right before collapsing." Maya didn't respond. She took a sip of water, the taste metallic, her throat burning as it went down. She wasn't lying, she'd been lucky. The explosion earlier had slammed her against a rock hard enough to bruise her ribs, maybe crack one, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She wouldn't let it. Daniels started to speak again, but a new sound cut through the air, the sharp crackle of the radio. "All units, this is command. We've got a distress signal. Patrol Delta hit by ambush 12 clicks out. Multiple casualties. Immediate evac requested." The room went still for half a breath. Then movement exploded again. Daniels looked at her. "You're not cleared for field duty yet." "I'm going," she said immediately. He frowned. "Carter, they need a medic. You said it yourself, I look like hell, not that I can't walk." He hesitated. He knew that tone. It wasn't defiance, it was conviction, the kind that couldn't be argued with. Finally he exhaled. "Fine, take Mason with you, he's fresh. Don't make me regret this." Maya grabbed her pack, checked her supplies, and nodded. "You won't." Outside, Lieutenant Mason was already waiting, adjusting his rifle strap. His face was younger, unscarred by years of service, but his eyes carried the same readiness she remembered in herself once. "You sure you're good to move?" he asked. "Good enough," she said. "Let's bring them home." The ride out was rough, dust whipping through the open cabin, the helicopter weaving through canyons under the fading light. Maya stared out the side, the terrain passing like a blur of gray and brown. Her body protested every vibration, but her mind was sharp, focused. When the chopper hovered above the drop zone, the pilot shouted, "This is as close as I can get. LZ's hot." They jumped. The ground hit hard, sending a shock through her spine. Gunfire echoed in the distance, faint but urgent. "Over that ridge," Mason pointed. They moved quickly, staying low, weaving between rocks and debris. As they crested the ridge, the scene unfolded below them. What was left of Patrol Delta pinned behind a crumbling wall, surrounded by smoke and sporadic gunfire. Maya's heart clenched. Too many bodies on the ground, too much blood. "Cover me," she yelled. Mason laid down suppressive fire as Maya sprinted toward the nearest wounded soldier. She dropped beside him, scanning the injury, a deep shrapnel wound in his abdomen. "Stay with me," she said, voice calm despite the chaos. "I've got you." Her hands worked fast, apply pressure, seal the wound, inject pain relief. The soldier's breathing slowed, steadied. "Next," she shouted. Another man lay slumped nearby, his arm mangled. Mason covered her as she moved again, the air thick with dust and fear. "Medic!" someone screamed. She turned just in time to see a grenade arc through the air, landing barely 5 meters away. Instinct took over. She threw herself over the nearest wounded man, curling around him as the blast hit. The explosion tore through the ground. Dust and heat engulfed her. The sound was gone, just a ringing void that swallowed everything. When it cleared, Maya coughed, pushing herself up. Her side burned, wet warmth spreading under her vest. She pressed a hand to her ribs and felt it, blood. "Not good." Mason was shouting something, his voice muffled through the ringing. He grabbed her arm, eyes wide. "You're hit." "I'm fine," she rasped. "Help me with him." They dragged the wounded toward the extraction point as the helicopter descended again. The world had become a blur of motion and pain. She could barely feel her legs by the time the last soldier was aboard. When they lifted off, Mason finally forced her to sit. "You're bleeding bad." She looked down. The side of her uniform was torn open, crimson spreading fast. Her head swam, but she forced a weak smile. "Guess I'll finally let someone else play medic." Mason's jaw tightened. "You're impossible." The helicopter pitched upward, climbing away from the firefight. The world outside the window was a blur of smoke and stars. Maya leaned back, feeling her pulse thrum weakly beneath her skin. Her vision blurred, but through it all, one image stayed sharp, the silver trident on her chest. It caught the light of the cabin, glowing faintly as though alive. Her father's voice drifted back to her memory. "Courage isn't about not bleeding, Maya. It's about standing when it hurts the most." Her eyes fluttered shut, but a faint smile touched her lips. "Still standing, Dad," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were real or just in her mind. As the helicopter raced back toward the base, her body was silent and bleeding, but her spirit, unyielding, refused to fade. The emblem over her heart pulsed softly, a promise she would not break. The helicopter's engine roared above her, but to Maya, it sounded distant, like thunder rolling from a world she was no longer part of. Every breath was a jagged edge, every heartbeat a hammer against broken ribs. She was aware of movement, hands pressing against her side, Mason's voice shouting something she couldn't make out. The world tilted and blurred, colors bleeding into one another. For a moment, she wasn't in a helicopter over a war-torn valley. She was somewhere else, somewhere quieter. Her father's voice echoed faintly. "You don't run from pain, Maya. You face it, you control it, you make it mean something." Her eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was the emblem on her chest, the silver trident, streaked with blood and dust, catching the faint light from the cabin. She forced a breath. How bad?" Mason's face hovered into focus. His hands were slick, his jaw clenched tight. "You've got a deep laceration, possible internal bleed. You're not fine, Lieutenant." Maya managed a weak smile. "I told you I never am." He shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he tightened the pressure bandage. She winced, biting down on the pain. "You should have stayed back," he said, his voice breaking with frustration. "And missed the fun," she whispered, her tone soft, teasing despite the blood pooling beneath her. "Not a chance." The cabin shook as the pilot shouted, "Approaching base. ETA 3 minutes." Mason didn't look up. His hand stayed firm on her side. "Stay with me, Maya." Her vision dimmed again. The weight of the night, the adrenaline crash, the cold creeping into her bones, it all pressed down like a wave. She'd been here before, on the edge of that quiet place where sound fades and the body wants to surrender. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. The helicopter hit the ground hard. The rear door swung open and medics rushed in, shouting commands over the noise. Hands lifted her, the cold night air biting her face. The lights of the base blurred into halos. "Lieutenant Carter, can you hear me?" someone yelled. She blinked, nodding faintly. "I'm here." "Internal bleeding suspected," Mason shouted as they transferred her onto a stretcher. "We need a trauma bay now." The medics moved fast. The rhythmic clatter of boots on metal echoed in her ears. The triage tent loomed ahead, its white canvas glowing under floodlights. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and fear. The noise was constant, orders barked, machines beeping, soldiers groaning in pain. Maya felt the stretcher drop gently onto a metal frame. Gloved hands began cutting through her uniform. She wanted to protest, to tell them to focus on the others, but her voice wouldn't come. "BP dropping. Get fluid started now." "Where? Daniels, we need him here." The words faded in and out, a language she'd spoken her whole life but suddenly couldn't follow. Her body trembled as the cold air hit her skin. Her thoughts scattered, fragments flashing one after another: the firefight, James bleeding on the ground, her father's trident glowing under red light. Then everything went black. When she woke again, it was quiet, too quiet. The air was still, heavy with the faint buzz of electricity. A dim light glowed above her. She wasn't in the triage tent anymore. The walls were solid, a proper room. The sterile smell told her this was the base infirmary. She turned her head slightly and winced. Pain flared along her ribs, but she was alive. Mason was sitting in a chair by the bed, his uniform still dusty, his head tilted forward in exhaustion. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. The sound came out as a rasp. "Mason." His head jerked up instantly. Relief washed across his face. "Hey, you're awake." "How long?" "Almost a day. You lost a lot of blood. They thought they might have to evac you out." Her eyes dropped to her chest. Fresh bandages wrapped tight around her ribs, and just above them, pinned carefully to the clean fabric of her undershirt, the silver trident. Someone had taken it off before surgery and then put it back. She touched it gently. The edges were cold, unfamiliar against the warmth of her skin. Mason noticed. "They found it on your uniform, thought you'd want it close." She nodded weakly. "Yeah, thanks." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You scared the hell out of us, Carter. Reynolds hasn't stopped packing since you went under." She smiled faintly. "He'd miss yelling at me." Mason laughed softly. "Yeah, maybe." Then his voice dropped. "You shouldn't have gone out there. You were already hurt." Her gaze drifted to the ceiling. "If I hadn't, more would have died." "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," she whispered. "That's what we do." Silence settled between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Eventually, Mason stood. "You should rest. Daniel says you'll need at least a week before you're field ready again." She gave him a look. "We both know that's not happening." He sighed, smiling despite himself. "You're impossible, you know that." She didn't answer, just watched as he left, the flap of the door closing softly behind him. For a long time, Maya lay there, listening to the hum of the machines. The quiet should have been peaceful, but instead it pressed against her like a weight. She stared at the trident again, the reflection of light glinting off its surface. Her father had once told her that the emblem wasn't just a badge. It was a promise to serve, to endure, to protect, no matter the cost. But he died keeping that promise, and now she was following the same path. A deep ache swelled in her chest, not just from injury but from something older, a grief that never truly faded. "Was it worth it for you?" she whispered into the stillness. "Is it worth it for me?" The air didn't answer, but she could almost imagine her father's voice again, calm and steady as always. "It's not about worth, Maya. It's about what you can live with." The following days blurred together. Checkups, rest, reports. She healed, at least on paper, but her body wasn't the only thing fractured. Each night when the lights dimmed, she saw the same flashes, the muzzle fire, the wounded soldier gasping for air, the way the world had slowed when she realized she was bleeding. And then always the trident, watching her. By the 5th day, she'd had enough of lying still. She got up, ignoring the sharp protest in her ribs, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The base was alive again, soldiers moving supplies, mechanics shouting over the roar of engines, a hum of constant, relentless purpose. Chief Daniels spotted her immediately. "You're supposed to be in bed." "Can't heal lying down forever," she said. He frowned, crossing his arms. "You're still bleeding internally, Carter. You push too hard and it'll get worse." She gave him a small, tired smile. "It's already worse when I do nothing." Daniel studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You remind me of your father." Her chest tightened. He was stubborn too. "Worse," he smiled faintly. "But he knew when to rest. That's what kept him alive longer than most." Maya's eyes drifted to the horizon, a faint line of smoke rising in the distance. Another mission. Another team out there risking everything. She turned back to Daniels. "Rest later, work now." He shook his head, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Just don't die on my watch." "No promises." The day passed in a haze of motion. She helped with triage, organized supplies, checked on recovering soldiers. Every interaction, every small act of care, steadied her heartbeat a little more. And yet, every time she caught her reflection in a polished metal surface, in a window, in the eyes of another medic, she saw the same thing. The trident gleaming faintly, streaked with memories. By nightfall, she found herself back where it had all begun, at the edge of the outcrop overlooking the valley. The wind was cool again, brushing gently against her face. The horizon stretched endless, painted with the fading colors of dusk. She traced the trident with her fingertips and whispered softly, "You gave everything for this, Dad. I understand now." She didn't mean the war. She meant the weight, the quiet burden of those who heal and fight, who lead and bleed and never stop moving forward. Behind her, footsteps approached. Mason again. "You're not supposed to be up here alone," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "I'm not alone." He followed her gaze toward the fading light, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're not." For a while they stood there in silence. Two soldiers bound not by orders, but by the invisible thread of what they'd seen, what they'd survived. Finally, Mason spoke. "You know, Reynolds wants to assign you to training duty until you're cleared for ops." "Training?" she laughed softly. "Ground me, you mean?" "Keep you alive," he corrected. She looked down at the trident one last time, its edges catching the glow of the dying sun. "Maybe that's enough for now." The wind carried her words away, soft and uncertain. For once, she didn't chase them. The night settled, and for the first time in weeks, Maya Carter let herself simply breathe, silent, bleeding, but alive. Why did the quiet feel so loud? Lieutenant Maya Carter sat on the edge of her bunk, the dim light from a single bulb casting long shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, the night buzzed faintly with life, distant chatter, the hum of generators, the occasional clang of metal. Yet in her small corner of the world, everything felt still. Too still. The bandages around her ribs were tight, each breath a careful negotiation between pain and stubbornness. The doctors had ordered her to rest, but rest had never sat well with her. The body could heal, yes, but the mind, the spirit, they rarely obeyed the same timeline. On the small table beside her lay her uniform jacket, cleaned, pressed. The silver trident gleamed faintly in the muted light, as though daring her to put it back on. Her fingers hovered over it, tracing its outline without touching it. It was strange how a symbol so small could carry the weight of so many lives. Her father's face drifted through her mind again, steady eyes, weathered smile. "You'll know you're ready when you stop needing the uniform to remind you who you are," he'd once told her. But she wasn't sure she'd ever stop needing it. A knock on the tent pole broke her thoughts. "Lieutenant, you awake?" The voice was familiar, Lieutenant Mason. "Come in," she called softly. He stepped through, still in his dusty fatigues, carrying 2 mugs of something that smelled like coffee but wasn't quite. "Didn't think you'd be sleeping," he said, handing her one. "Wasn't planning to." He smirked faintly and sat on the opposite bunk. "You're still supposed to be resting." "I am," she said, taking a careful sip. "Sitting here, breathing, contemplating my life choices, that counts as rest." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, the captain's been talking about moving you to training duty. New recruits could use someone who's actually been out there." Maya raised an eyebrow. Translation: "They don't trust me not to bleed out in the field." "It's not that," he said quickly. "They just care. You scared everyone, Maya, even Reynolds." Her gaze drifted toward the flap of the tent, where the wind whispered through. "People like us don't get scared," she said quietly. "We just keep moving." Mason studied her for a moment. "You say that like you believe it." She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back, closing her eyes. The faint hum of the bass filled the silence between them. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. Almost. The next morning, Maya reported to the training grounds before sunrise. The air was cold, the kind that stung the lungs but cleared the mind. Rows of recruits stood at attention, fresh faces, clean uniforms, eyes full of the kind of confidence only those untouched by war carried. Captain Reynolds was already there, clipboard in hand. He turned as she approached. "You sure you're up for this?" "Better than sitting around waiting for my body to forget what it's for," she replied. He gave a small nod, a trace of pride hiding behind his usual stern expression. "Then you're in charge of medical drills and combat first response. I want them trained like their lives depend on it, because they do." "Yes, sir." She took her place before the recruits, dozens of young eyes fixed on her, curious, unsure. She could almost feel their thoughts. "She's small, she's quiet. She doesn't look like the stories we've heard." Good, she thought, let them underestimate her. "Out here," she began, voice steady and clear, "the difference between life and death isn't how well you shoot or how fast you run. It's how calm you stay when everything falls apart." She walked slowly down the line, meeting each recruit's gaze. "You'll be trained to fight, to survive. But remember this, your job isn't just to kill the enemy. It's to keep your brothers and sisters alive. That's what separates a soldier from a killer." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one moved. Then one of the recruits, a tall, nervous-looking man barely out of his teens, raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "how do you do that? Stay calm, I mean, when everything goes wrong." Maya paused, studying him. The question wasn't naive, it was real, honest. She took a slow breath. "You don't," she said quietly. "You just learn to move anyway." The recruits shifted uneasily, the weight of her answer sinking in. That day bled into another and then another. Maya poured herself into the work. Training became her medicine. Each demonstration, each lecture, each simulation was a way to keep the ghosts quiet for a little while. She taught them how to pack wounds, how to drag a fallen teammate through fire, how to think when panic clawed at the edge of reason. And yet, each time she demonstrated a tourniquet or mimed pressure against a bleeding wound, her hands remembered the real thing, the warmth of blood, the desperate pulse fatting beneath her fingers. By the third week, the pain in her ribs had dulled to a manageable ache, but a different pain had taken root, the kind that no amount of training could numb. One evening, after dismissing the recruits, she lingered on the empty field. The sun was setting again, painting the horizon in burnt gold. Her shadow stretched long across the dirt. She stared at the trident on her chest, the same one her father had worn. It glimmered faintly, like an old memory refusing to fade. "Hey," came a voice behind her, "Mason again." She didn't turn. "You really like sneaking up on people, don't you?" He smiled as he walked up beside her. "You just don't notice me until I talk." They stood there in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun disappear. Then he asked quietly, "You ever think about quitting?" The question caught her off guard. She turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "You've done your part more than most ever will. You almost died out there. You could walk away, you know. Nobody would blame you." Maya's eyes softened. "That's just it. If I walk away, who stays?" Mason looked down, scuffing the dirt with his boot. "You sound like Reynolds. Maybe he's finally rubbing off on me." They both laughed softly, the sound small but real. Then from the command tower in the distance, an alarm blared, a shrill, mechanical wail that shattered the moment. Reynolds' voice followed through the loudspeakers. "All medical personnel to triage. Incoming evac chopper. Multiple casualties inbound." Maya's heart stuttered. For a second she froze. The training field, the sunset, Mason's words all vanished. Instinct took over. "Let's move," she shouted. By the time she reached the medical tents, the helicopter was already touching down. Dust swirled through the floodlights as stretchers were pulled out. The smell of blood hit her first, sharp, metallic, familiar. 3 soldiers, one barely conscious, one missing half his gear, the third she couldn't even tell where the wounds began. "Pressure wounds here. Start IV. Get him on the monitor now." Maya dropped to her knees beside the worst of them, her hands already moving. Her ribs screamed, but she ignored the pain. The world around her became a tunnel of motion and noise, every sound drowned out except the heartbeat in her ears. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing down on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "You hear me? You're not dying here." The soldier's eyes flickered open, glassy with fear. It hurts." "I know," she said softly, "but you hold on just a little longer." Her gloves were slick, the bandages soaked. She worked faster, sealing the wound, calling for suction, for blood. Around her, medics shouted orders, the chaos reaching a fever pitch. And then silence. The monitor flatlined. "No," she muttered, pressing harder. "Come on, come on." Daniels appeared beside her, his voice low but firm. "Carter, that's enough." She froze, her hand stayed on the soldier's chest, unmoving. "No, he's not gone yet." "Maya." Her name, said softly, but with the finality of truth. Her fingers loosened. The soldier's head lolled to the side, the life gone from his eyes. The weight hit her all at once. She leaned back, staring at her blood-soaked hands. It never got easier. It wasn't supposed to. Daniels placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did everything right." She nodded faintly, and still lost him. He sighed. "We can't save them all." "Then why do we try?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Later that night, long after the chaos had died down, Maya sat outside the medical tent alone. The air was cold again, the stars sharp. Her hands still trembled from the adrenaline crash. She looked down at the trident on her chest. For the first time it didn't gleam. It was dull, almost gray under the moonlight. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I really am." The wind didn't answer. But somewhere in that silence, in the weight of loss and the whisper of the night, something inside her steadied. The mission never ended, the pain never stopped, but neither did she. Because somewhere deep down, beneath the blood and the ghosts, she understood what her father meant all those years ago. Courage wasn't about surviving every battle. It was about showing up for the next one. Why did it always happen in the quiet after? The base had gone still. The wounded were stable. The dead had been taken away. And yet, Lieutenant Maya Carter sat outside the triage tent, her hands still trembling, the smell of blood and antiseptic clinging to her like a ghost that refused to leave. The stars were cold and distant above her. The desert wind brushed against her skin, dry and bitter, whispering through the tents like a memory that wouldn't die. Her gloves lay beside her on the dirt, stiff, darkened, stained with the last life she couldn't save. She had done everything right. Every procedure, every call, every move that protocol demanded. And still, he had slipped away beneath her hands. Her father had once told her that medicine in war was half skill, half mercy, but there was no mercy tonight, only silence. The flap of the tent behind her rustled and Mason stepped out. He had removed his gear, his face pale beneath the floodlights. "You haven't moved in 2 hours." "I know." He crouched beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "He was gone before he hit the pad, Maya. You did all you could." She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the jagged outline of mountains. It wasn't enough. He exhaled slowly. It's never enough. They sat there for a long moment, the silence between them heavier than words. Finally, he said softly, "You should rest," Daniel said. "Daniel says a lot of things," she interrupted. "He doesn't have to look them in the eyes while they fade out." Her voice cracked, the first fracture in a wall she'd spent years building. Mason didn't respond. He just stayed beside her, letting the silence speak what neither of them could. After a while she stood, dusting her hands off on her fatigues. "I'm going to walk. It's almost 300. I won't go far." He hesitated but didn't stop her. "If Reynolds asks where you are, tell him I'm still fighting." The base faded behind her as she walked toward the ridge overlooking the valley. The sand shifted softly beneath her boots. The air grew cooler, quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When she reached the edge, she sat down on a rock, staring at the faint shimmer of dawn that hadn't yet touched the horizon. Her fingers traced the trident on her chest again. It was clean now, polished, even, but she swore she could still see the blood beneath it. She remembered the day she'd earned it, the day she'd stood soaked in salt water after Hell Week, her body broken, her mind stripped bare. The instructor had pinned it on her chest and said, "This isn't a medal, it's a mirror. Every time you look at it, it'll show you what you really are." At the time she hadn't understood. She thought it meant strength, resilience, glory. Now, sitting in the desert with the weight of loss pressing down on her chest, she understood. It didn't show what she was, it showed what she carried. Her father's voice drifted through her mind again. "There'll come a day when you'll have to choose between saving someone else and saving yourself." She whispered into the darkness, "I already did." The wind answered with nothing but silence. Back at the base, the sun eventually rose. The golden light spilled over the tents, painting everything in the deceptive calm of a new day. But inside, the air was still heavy, thick with fatigue and grief. Maya returned to the medical tent just as Captain Reynolds was reviewing the previous night's report. His jaw tightened when he saw her. "You didn't check in." "I needed air." He studied her, eyes sharp. "Air or escape?" "Same thing sometimes." He sighed, setting the clipboard down. "You've done more in the last month than anyone could ask. You're running on fumes, Carter. You need rest." "I can't." "Yes, you can. That's an order." She looked at him, something breaking quietly behind her steady gaze. "And if someone dies while I'm resting, sir, what then?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched until he finally said, softer now, "You're not responsible for all of them." "Yes, I am," she whispered. "That's the problem." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You remind me too much of your father." Her voice softened. He was good at pretending he was fine too. Reynolds' expression shifted, guilt, understanding, respect all flickering behind his eyes. "Take the day. That's not a suggestion." She gave a faint nod and walked out. But rest wasn't what she needed. She needed meaning, something to tether her to the reason she still wore the trident at all. By mid-afternoon, she was in the hangar, where the gear was cleaned and checked after every mission. Rows of armor, weapons, and packs lined the walls. One of the younger soldiers, a woman barely in her 20s, was struggling to lift a heavy medical pack. Maya approached quietly. "Mind if I help?" she asked. The young soldier straightened immediately. "Lieutenant Carter, sorry ma'am, I didn't." "Relax," Maya said gently. She lifted the pack easily, slinging it over her shoulder. "How long you been here?" 2 months, the girl replied. "First deployment." Maya nodded. "That's about when you start to realize nothing you trained for actually prepares you for the noise, right?" The soldier smiled nervously. "Yeah, exactly that." Maya set the pack down beside her and said quietly, "When it starts to feel too heavy, remember, it's not about being fearless. It's about being useful. Fear's fine, just don't freeze." The girl nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." Maya started to walk away, then paused. "What's your name?" "Corporal Elena Ruiz." Maya offered a small smile. "Good luck, Ruiz, you'll need it." As she stepped outside, the sound of helicopter blades began to build again. Another mission, another team heading out. She stopped at the edge of the tarmac, watching them board. The rhythmic thump of the rotors hit her like a heartbeat, familiar, haunting. Mason appeared beside her, squinting against the sun. "You're thinking about going back out there, aren't you?" "I'm always thinking about it." He folded his arms. "You're still not cleared." She smiled faintly. "Since when has that stopped me?" He sighed. "You're going to break yourself." "I already did," she said softly. "Now I'm just seeing how far I can bend before I can't stand up again." He didn't know what to say. So he stayed silent, watching with her as the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the distance. That night, when the base finally grew quiet again, Maya sat alone in her tent, a small journal open in front of her. Her handwriting was rough, uneven, the words pressed hard into the page. "Day 47. Lost another one. Doesn't matter how many times you see it, it always cuts deeper. I tell the others to stay calm, to breathe through the chaos. I tell them the pain fades, but it doesn't. It just changes shape." Her pen hesitated, then continued. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the trident isn't about who you save, but who you become when you can't save them." She closed the journal and stared at the fabric above her. The wind outside rustled softly, carrying the distant hum of a generator and the muted laughter of soldiers trying to forget. She envied them in a way, their ability to laugh after all this, but she couldn't, not yet. Her ribs still ached, her body still bore the bruises, but it was the invisible wounds that throbbed the loudest, the ones no medic could treat. Sleep came in fragments, images of faces, flashes of muzzle fire, the echo of her father's voice. And when morning came, it wasn't the light that woke her. It was the sound of engines again. Another chopper, another mission. The fight never stopped. It just waited for her to stand up again. She rose slowly, wincing at the pain in her side. Her uniform hung on the chair, the trident catching the morning light. For a long moment she stared at it. Then, with steady hands, she pinned it back over her heart. Her reflection in the small mirror by the cot was pale, tired but resolute. "I'm not done," she whispered to herself. "Not yet." Outside, the desert wind picked up again, swirling dust across the base. She stepped out into it, shoulders squared, her shadow long across the sand. Somewhere behind her, Mason called her name, but she didn't turn back. Because this was who she was, the medic who refused to stop fighting, even when she was the one bleeding. The silver trident gleamed against the rising sun, catching light like a promise renewed. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And Maya Carter, silent and bleeding, was already moving toward the next battle. Why did the alarms always sound louder at dawn? The world was still gray when the first siren shattered the fragile silence. Lieutenant Maya Carter jolted upright, her body reacting before her mind caught up. The air inside the tent vibrated with urgency, the kind that didn't wait for explanations. Outside, boots thundered against gravel, radios crackled with clipped voices, and the deep thump of rotor blades grew louder by the second. She pulled on her uniform, ignoring the ache in her ribs, and stepped into the chaos. "Status," she shouted over the noise. Chief Daniels turned, his face drawn tight. Convoy ambushed 20 clicks out. Multiple wounded, possible survivors trapped. We've got air support en route, but they need a medic on the ground. Maya froze. How bad? Bad, he said grimly. We've got reports of small arms fire still in the area. Extraction won't be clean. She scanned the loading pad, soldiers rushing to load stretchers, pilots shouting coordinates, the dust whipping around in the rising wind. She could feel the adrenaline start to burn through her fatigue. I'm going, she said. Daniel stared at her. You're not cleared, Carter. I don't care. He stepped closer, his voice hard. You're still healing. You collapse out there and someone else dies trying to save you. Maya's jaw tightened. You need someone who knows how to keep men alive under fire. That's me. He held her gaze for a long moment, then sighed, the kind of sigh that said he knew he couldn't stop her. Fine, but you take Mason with you. He's your shadow. Mason appeared just then, strapping on his vest. I was already getting the bird ready, he said, smirking faintly. Maya shot him a look. You knew I wouldn't sit this one out. Of course I did, he said. You're predictable in the worst ways. Minutes later, the helicopter lifted off. The base shrank beneath them, swallowed by the vast desert. The morning sun had just begun to rise, a thin strip of orange cutting across the endless dunes. Maya checked her gear mechanically. Tourniquets, morphine, sealants, plasma packs. Her fingers moved on instinct, muscle memory, overriding the tremor of pain that still lingered from her last wound. Across from her, Mason was watching her quietly. You sure you're good? She didn't look up. Define good. He exhaled through his nose. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not, she said. I just can't sit and wait for someone else to bleed out when I can help. He gave a small, resigned nod. Then I'll make sure you come back breathing. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms. Approaching LZ, smoke markers in sight, looks hot. The moment the helicopter dropped low, the world exploded into chaos. Smoke billowed from two burning vehicles, black plumes twisting into the sky. The ground was scattered with debris, twisted metal, shattered glass, fragments of gear. Go, go, go. Maya hit the dirt running. Bullets snapped overhead, digging into the sand. She dove behind a burned-out truck, scanning for movement. Mason covered her flank, firing short bursts toward the ridgeline. Contact left, he shouted. She spotted a hand waving through the smoke. One of their men, pinned behind a vehicle. I see him, she yelled, grabbing her medical pack. Cover me. Carter, wait. Too late. She sprinted through the open, the world narrowing into the rhythmic thunder of her heart. The air burned with gunpowder and dust. When she reached the soldier, she dropped to her knees. Blood was pooling beneath him, dark and thick. Hold still, she said, tearing open a bandage pack. You're gonna be fine. The soldier coughed weakly, eyes wild. Ambush, they came out of nowhere. Save your breath. She pressed hard on the wound, feeling the warmth pulse between her fingers. Mason's voice cut through the comms. We've got movement on the ridge. 2 tangos down, more inbound. Her breathing quickened. The wound was deep, an arterial hit. She clamped a tourniquet, sealed the gash with coagulant foam, then looked up at Mason. We need a vac now. He gestured toward the helicopter circling above. Pilot says he can't land until we suppress fire. Then we suppress it. She grabbed the soldier's vest and dragged him behind cover. Her side screamed in pain, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. When the chopper finally dropped in, the noise was deafening. Mason covered her as she loaded the wounded soldier on board. She climbed in after him, pressing a hand against the bandage as the helicopter lifted off again. The world tilted and spun, wind roaring through the cabin. The soldier's breathing hitched, shallow and weak. Stay with me, Maya whispered. Don't quit on me now. But deep down, she knew he was slipping. His eyes fluttered once, twice, then went still. The monitor flatlined. Maya froze, her hand still pressed against his chest. For a moment, the noise of the rotors faded. The world shrank to just her and the body in front of her. Mason reached out, his voice soft but firm. "Carter, he's gone." Her throat tightened. "No." She pressed harder, trying again, forcing air into his lungs, ignoring the blood that smeared across her arms. "Come on, come on." "Carter." Her name again, a command and a mercy all in one. She stopped, her shoulders sagged. The pilot shouted something, coordinates, orders, but Maya didn't hear. Her hands were shaking. Her ribs burned. Her mind was a blur of noise and memory. She stared at the soldier's dog tags hanging from his neck. Ruiz E. Her breath caught. No. It couldn't be. The young woman from the hangar, the one she'd spoken to just days ago. The world tilted violently. Her vision blurred, nausea clawing at her chest. Mason reached out to steady her, but she pushed him away. She was just, Maya's voice cracked. She was just here. "I know," Mason said quietly. "I'm sorry." But the words meant nothing. The helicopter rattled through turbulence, but Maya didn't notice. She sat there, frozen, staring at the lifeless body of a soldier who'd once looked up to her. A soldier she'd promised would survive. When they landed back at base, she didn't speak. She didn't move. Mason had to pull her out of the helicopter. Daniels was waiting on the pad. One look at her face and his expression darkened. "Who?" Mason hesitated. "Ruiz." Daniels closed his eyes briefly, the weight settling on his shoulders. Maya stood there, blood still on her hands, her uniform soaked in dust and sweat. "She was new," she said softly. "She hadn't even—" "I know," Daniels said. "Get her cleaned up." But Maya didn't move. "She looked at me, Daniels. She asked me how to stay calm when everything goes wrong. I told her to keep moving." Her voice broke. She tried to move. Daniels didn't have an answer. There wasn't one. Mason guided her away gently, hand on her back, steering her toward the med bay. She walked like a ghost, her boots heavy in the dirt. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The room smelled of antiseptic and metal. She sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the floor. Mason crouched in front of her. "You did everything you could, Maya." "I told her she'd be fine." "She knew the risks." "That doesn't make it easier," she whispered. He sighed. "You can't carry every death." She looked up, eyes raw and hollow. "Then what's the point of the emblem?" He hesitated. She reached up, unclipped the trident from her chest, and held it in her hand. The silver was dull now, streaked with dirt and blood. "We wear this like it means something," she said softly. "But maybe it's just a reminder of what we lose." Mason didn't try to take it from her. He just said quietly, "Or maybe it's what keeps us going." She stared at the emblem for a long time. Then slowly, she clipped it back over her heart. Because he was right, she couldn't stop. Not yet, not while anyone else was still breathing. Later that night, she walked back to the ridge overlooking the valley. The moon hung low, pale and distant. She whispered into the wind, "I'm sorry, Ruiz." The desert stayed silent, but for a brief moment she thought she heard something, the faint echo of a laugh, carried by the wind. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the sound of a promise still echoing in the dark. Maya stood there until the first light of dawn touched the horizon. Then she squared her shoulders and turned back toward the base. The trident glimmered faintly against her chest, tarnished, bloodied, but still there. Sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the choice to go again. And that was exactly what she did. How do you save others when you can't save yourself? That question had lived in the back of Maya Carter's mind since the day she put on the trident. But now, after Ruiz, it was no longer a whisper. It was a constant, punishing echo. The base was quiet again, the kind of quiet that came after too many funerals. Ruiz's photo sat on a small makeshift memorial near the flagpole, a picture from training where she was laughing, squinting against the sun. Someone had placed her helmet beneath it, a small bouquet of wild desert flowers tucked inside. Maya stood there for a long time, not moving, not breathing deeply enough to break the stillness. Mason approached quietly behind her, setting down a single shell casing at the base of the photo, the team's way of saying goodbye. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. After a moment, Maya said softly, she was 19. 20, he corrected gently. Still a child. He looked at her, then at the picture. She wanted to be here. You didn't force her. Maya nodded slightly, but her voice came out thin. She looked up to me, and I sent her out there. She volunteered. She trusted me. Mason exhaled, rubbing his jaw. You think that makes it your fault? I know it does. He studied her, searching for the right words, but none came, because he'd seen it before, that look in her eyes. The one her father had carried before his final mission. The same weight, the same guilt, the same exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. That night, Maya didn't return to her tent. Instead, she walked out past the perimeter, to the ridge that overlooked the endless desert. The stars were bright, cruelly so, each one a pinpoint of light, cold and perfect, watching from an uncaring sky. She sat down on the sand, her knees pulled close, her rifle across her lap. The wind was soft tonight, brushing strands of hair across her face. For once, it wasn't hostile. It almost felt like memory. Her thoughts spiraled, not of war or duty, but of before. Her father's kitchen in North Carolina, the smell of coffee and oil, the sound of rain tapping against the window. He had been sitting at the table the night before his last deployment, trident in hand. She remembered asking, "Aren't you scared?" He had smiled faintly. "Of course I am. Fear means you still care what happens." "Then why go?" she asked. "Because caring is the job." She hadn't understood then. But now, staring at the trident against her chest, streaked with dirt and blood and regret, she finally did. It wasn't about heroism, or medals, or being the strongest. It was about caring, even when it hurt too much to keep doing it. Her radio crackled faintly, pulling her back. "Carter, come in, you out there again?" It was Reynolds. "Yeah," she said quietly. A pause, then, "We've got something you might want to see. Command just sent a message through." "Copy," she replied, standing slowly, brushing sand off her uniform. When she reached the command tent, the room fell silent. Reynolds and Daniels were both standing near a monitor, the faint glow casting tired lines across their faces. Reynolds turned toward her. "We intercepted a distress signal. Civilian aid convoy ambushed north of Sector 12. They're pinned down, no combat team nearby." Daniels crossed his arms. "We've got permission to send a small extraction unit. 2 birds. You're not required to go, Carter." Maya looked between them. "But you need a medic." Reynolds' brow furrowed. "You sure about this?" "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Gear up, wheels up in 15. Mason appeared as she turned to leave. "You don't stop, do you?" "Would you?" He smiled faintly. "Guess not." 15 minutes later, they were airborne again. The desert rolled beneath them, endless and pale under moonlight. The helicopter's red interior lights painted everything in shades of blood and shadow. Maya sat silently, eyes fixed on the map. Every heartbeat was measured, every breath controlled. Her ribs still hurt. Her hands still trembled when she wasn't paying attention. But she felt something she hadn't in weeks: clarity. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. When they arrived at the coordinates, the convoy was chaos, trucks burning, gunfire echoing through the canyon walls. Civilians huddled behind overturned vehicles, their faces pale with terror. "Touching down," the pilot shouted. Maya hit the ground running, her pack slamming against her back. Mason and 2 others spread out, returning fire to suppress the attackers. She found the first wounded man behind a half-destroyed supply truck, shrapnel embedded in his chest. "Stay with me," she said, dropping beside him. Her hands worked automatically, sealing the wound, inserting a chest tube, her movements precise and fast. Gunfire cracked overhead. She barely flinched. "Carter, left flank," Mason's voice rang out. She turned, eyes sharp. A figure was moving toward them, one of the attackers. Mason fired, dropping him before he reached the civilians. The chaos pressed in, but Maya's mind was calm, steady in the storm. Her heartbeat synced with the rhythm of necessity. Pressure, seal, lift, move. The second casualty was a woman, mid-30s, bleeding from a leg wound. Maya carried her to the extraction zone herself, ignoring the fire around her. When the last evac bird arrived, she was covered in dust and blood again. But this time, none of it was hers. The helicopters lifted off, leaving the burning wrecks below like fatting ghosts. Inside, the rescued civilians sat in stunned silence. One woman clutched a child to her chest, whispering a prayer in a language Maya didn't understand. Across from her, Mason met her eyes. "You okay?" She nodded, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, I think I am." He leaned back against the seat, exhaling deeply. "You saved 12 people tonight." She looked down at her bloodied hands. "Then maybe that balances one I couldn't." He smiled faintly. "It doesn't work like that." "I know," she said softly, "but it helps." When they landed, the base was already stirring again. The rescued civilians were led to the triage tents, their gratitude quiet but heavy. Reynolds met her on the pad, arms crossed. "Heard you went full ghost out there." Maya shrugged. "Just doing my job, sir." He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Your father would have been proud." The words hit harder than gunfire. She didn't respond, just nodded once, then walked away. Later in her tent, she sat alone again, her uniform still stained, the trident faintly catching the light of a single flickering bulb. For a long time, she just stared at it. Then she unpinned it. And for the first time, instead of cleaning it or tucking it away, she set it gently on the table beside Ruiz's dog tag, which she had kept since the day of the ambush. 2 emblems, one shining, one dull. A reminder of loss, of duty, of what it meant to keep caring when it hurt. She whispered, "I hope I'm still worthy of it." Outside, a soft breeze lifted the edge of the tent. The desert was quiet again, stretching infinite under the stars. Maya leaned back, her body exhausted but her mind finally still. In the distance, a new day was beginning, faint light brushing against the horizon. For the first time in months, she didn't feel empty. She felt grounded, present. She still hurt, the ghosts were still there, but now they didn't haunt her, they stood beside her. She picked up the trident again, holding it in her palm. The metal was cold but steady. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the tent, she smiled faintly. She finally understood. The trident wasn't about who lived or died. It was about who stayed. Why did coming home feel harder than the battlefield? The plane touched down on American soil just after dawn. A soft drizzle swept across the tarmac, the kind that blurred everything into watercolor shades of gray. Lieutenant Maya Carter watched through the small window as the aircrew unlatched the cargo hold. For the first time in years, there was no dust, no gunfire, no alarms, only the low hum of engines and the steady drum of rain on steel. Mason sat across from her, eyes half closed, exhausted but alive. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" he murmured. "What does?" "The quiet." She managed a faint smile. "Yeah, it's too clean." They stepped off the ramp together, the wet air sharp and cold against their faces. Somewhere beyond the fences, a brass band was playing for another unit arriving home. Cheers, flags, tears. But their own landing was unceremonious, just another rotation ending. A transport officer met them, clipboard in hand. Lieutenant Carter, Captain Reynolds requests you report to command in 48 hours for debrief. Until then, you're on stand down." She nodded, understood. When she finally reached the barracks, she didn't unpack, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bunk, staring at the rain streaking the small window. The trident still hung on her chest, dulled now from months of sand and blood. She touched it lightly. It felt heavier than it ever had. That night she dreamed again. She was back in the canyon. Smoke, fire, Ruiz calling her name, the sound of rotors, and then silence, always silence. She woke with a start, the room dark except for the faint glow of city lights filtering through the blinds. Her heart hammered, breath coming fast. She pressed her palms to her face, forcing herself to slow down. "You're home," she whispered, "you're home." But it didn't feel like home, not yet. The next day she found herself standing in front of a mirror she didn't recognize. The reflection staring back was leaner, older, the eyes sharper but distant. A faint scar traced along her ribs, hidden beneath the fabric. She unpinned the trident and set it on the sink. Without it, the uniform felt lighter. She studied her own face, the lines of exhaustion, the quiet ache behind her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to simply look human. Later, she met Mason downtown. Civilian clothes, coffee shop, a normal morning by anyone else's standards. He raised his cup toward her. "You actually showed up. I half expected you to be running drills somewhere." She smirked. "You can't run drills on yourself forever." He chuckled. "You'll try." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of traffic filling the spaces between their thoughts. Finally, Mason said, "Reynolds put you in for a commendation." She looked up surprised. "For what?" "For everything, for staying when others couldn't." She shook her head. "They shouldn't give medals for surviving." "Maybe not," he said softly, "but people need to remember who kept them alive." Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. "I'm not sure I want to remember." "Then remember Ruiz," he said. "Remember why you stayed." Her throat tightened. "I already do." He nodded, standing. "Debrief tomorrow. After that, whatever you decide, you've earned it." She watched him walk away through the rain-spotted glass, his reflection fading into the crowd. For the first time, she wondered what earning it really meant. The debrief room was sterile, white walls, humming fluorescent lights, a single folder on the table. Captain Reynolds sat across from her, his posture rigid but his eyes tired. "You readjusting okay?" he asked. She shrugged, still figuring out what normal is. He offered a small nod. "You've got leave approved, 3 months, maybe more. After that, the Navy wants you stateside instructor position." She blinked. "Teaching? Who better?" Maya looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I can tell them how to do what I did." Reynolds leaned forward. "Then tell them what it costs. That's the part we never say out loud." The words settled deep. She realized then that the mission was never really over. It just changed shape. When she left the building, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, thin lights spilling across the wet pavement. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the trident. The surface caught the light, small scratches, dents, stories. Every mark meant something. She thought of her father, of Ruiz, of every soldier whose blood had stained her hands. And for the first time, she didn't feel crushed by the weight of it. She felt anchored by it. Weeks passed. She traveled home to the small coastal town where she'd grown up. The sea smelled the same, salt, rust, and memory. Her father's old house stood at the end of the road, the porch sagging slightly, wind chimes whispering in the breeze. Inside, everything was preserved as if waiting. Photos lined the mantel, her parents, her father in uniform, a younger version of her in cadet blues. She stood in front of the largest frame, her father, smiling, trident gleaming on his chest. She reached out and traced the glass. "I get it now," she whispered. The house creaked, settling around her. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet wash over her. Later that evening, she walked down to the shore. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath her boots. She crouched by the water's edge, the trident in her hand. The metal caught the fading light one last time. "You carried it long enough," she murmured. "Your turn to rest." She set it gently into the surf. The waves rolled over it, lifting it, pulling it out a few feet before it settled halfway in the sand, glinting under the water. She didn't cry, she didn't need to. The act itself was enough. Behind her, footsteps approached. Mason's voice drifted through the sea breeze. "Couldn't let you disappear without saying goodbye." She turned, smiling faintly. "I'm not disappearing." He gestured to the water, letting go then. "Not letting go," she said softly, "just leaving it where it belongs." He followed her gaze to the trident half buried in the surf. "You know someone going to find that and think it's treasure." She chuckled quietly. "Maybe it is." They stood side by side as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky to fire and gold. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. After a while, Mason said, "So what now?" Maya watched the tide pull at the emblem again. "Teach," she said finally. "Train the next ones. Make sure they understand what the uniform really means." He smiled. "That sounds like you." "Maybe it sounds like who I'm supposed to be." The last light faded, leaving only the rhythmic sound of the sea. She took a deep breath, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. Months later, a new group of recruits stood at attention in a classroom far from the front lines. The walls were lined with photos, operations, medics, units long past. Maya Carter stood before them, wearing a simple uniform, no decorations except a small silver pendant shaped like a trident resting against her collarbone. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of someone who had lived every word. "You'll learn tactics, medicine, protocol," she told them. "But the hardest lessons aren't written in any manual. They're written in silence, in the spaces between gunfire and the moments after. They're written in what you do when no one's watching." A recruit raised a hand. "Ma'am, were you ever afraid?" She smiled faintly. "Every time, fear's proof that you still care." The room fell quiet. The recruits watched her, not as a hero, but as a mirror. Someone who had walked through the fire and come back quieter but stronger. After class, as they filed out, she lingered by the window. The sun was setting again, washing the training field in amber light. The wind carried faint laughter from the yard outside. She touched the pendant lightly, feeling its cool weight against her skin. Her father's words echoed once more. "You don't run from pain, Maya, you face it. You make it mean something." She smiled, because she finally had. That night, standing alone under the open sky, she looked up at the stars. They didn't seem so cold anymore, just distant, patient. Somewhere out there, she liked to believe, her father and Ruiz were watching, silent, proud, and free of the noise that still filled the living world. She took one last breath of the ocean air and whispered, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." The wind carried the words away across the dark water, where the waves whispered them back. And as the night settled around her, Lieutenant Maya Carter finally let herself believe that silence could also mean peace. End of story.